Hello, Curtis.
Hello, Tony.
Welcome to the Challenger University podcast, and thank you for agreeing to come on today.
No problem. I've been looking forward to it ever since you invited me. So yeah, I'm keen to have an interesting discussion today.
Brilliant. We will. We definitely will. Um, I came across you via your podcast, which we'll talk about in a minute. So I'm really excited to have you on. But for the listeners today and the listeners to come, could you please share your full name and what it is you do today for work?
Yeah, so I'm Curtis James, and I do a mix of things. I mean, I have this running joke with my friends and family about like how I describe what it is that I do, and it feels like this sort of lifelong challenge to try and get that into some simplified thing. But I'm a photographer, a filmmaker. I make podcasts. I do ethnographic research into all sorts of social issues, and that's my sort of work life. And then I'm a volunteer at a sort of campaign group called Class Divide, which I'm sure we'll come on to a little bit later. And Class Divide exists to try and stamp out education inequality, primarily in Brighton and Hove, where I grew
Mhm.
up. But we are spreading our wings across the country.
That is really exciting to hear. One of the things that you mentioned, be lovely if you could just describe it in a bit more detail, because I was interested when I saw this come up. When you talk about being an ethnographic researcher, what does that mean?
Well, I got into being an ethnographic researcher through work I was doing years and years ago, which was basically going into businesses and helping leaders and sort of senior teams sort their work life out. And one of the
Okay.
things I spotted when I was doing that work was actually a desire or a need to go a step before doing the actual work to understand where the need was. And so I became really interested in different ways of studying working life. And I'm a photographer, so I started using my camera to do that. And that developed into basically creating kits so people could do that stuff themselves. So that's called auto ethnography, when I support a group of people to document a part of their life. And a recent project is something I did for the King's Fund, where we worked with a bunch of early career nurses and midwives and supported them to journal their lives in the NHS. So ethnography means to write about stuff. So in its purest form, it's to write about what you're seeing and what you're experiencing.
Yeah.
But there's all sorts of different ways of doing it, and my way is primarily through photography.
Right. Wow. And I will put a link to the King's Fund piece that you mentioned in the show notes because I had a look at that and
Great.
loved it. Um, So this is quite a wide, connected, but a mixed bag of sort of different talents and skills that you have and work that you do. So let's go back in time to when you were pre having a career and to your experiences of secondary school education. What are your memories of that time of your life?
I would say 80% bad, 20% good. I didn't fit in secondary school into, I guess, the way that they expected me to learn.
Mm,
And that was mixed together also with being a carer for my mum. Not full time, but my mum had some mental health challenges. So through my teenage years, I had a lot of life stuff going on.
mm,
So, 80% of my memories of it are bad, but 20% are really good.
mhm.
There were I started doing my GCSEs actually in the first year GCSEs were introduced back in the 80s.
Yeah.
And there was a course that I did which basically made up two of my GCSEs. And I don't even know what it was called, but basically it gave me three lots of work experience. And I also did this project where, and it's my first experience, I think, of probably planning a project where I basically planned a rave. Now, it was a rave that was never going to happen, right? It was in my imagination, but I basically designed and planned out how to put on a rave. And I was like 14, 15.
Yeah.
So this is the 80s when rave stuff was like, big, and I was really interested in it. And that experience for me was, I hadn't thought about it until recently, but that was really quite an important experience for me. That and the work experience that I did, which was, one of them was in a place that hired out equipment to DJs and musicians and
Yeah.
gigs and clubs. Another was at a TV production company, and another one was at HMV Records. And those experiences, those work experience things that I did, again, all of that stuff came together really to give me quite an important end to my school life.
Yeah. There's three things that strike me. One is that I was going to raves when I was about 15, and I kind of didn't know how they got organized. Like I don't even remember how we even got tickets to these things, but that would have been, yeah, early 90s. So I just love that little cultural connection there. Um, two things you spoke about. You spoke about being like a young carer, which today I hear spoken about and acknowledged a lot in, how do we help young carers? And my guess is that at the time, how was that even recognized that that was something you were experiencing at the time? Did it get discussed?
I've thought about this a lot recently, and I talk about it in the Class Divide podcast. And I think in
Mm,
the podcast I said that no one at school knew, but
mm,
actually, as I've thought about it more, I think there were a couple of teachers that were aware it was going on in my life,
mm,
and but it wasn't. There was no social services involved. There was no.
mm,
Barely anyone knew that it was happening in my lives. It was me and my twin brother, and we were very much in it together with our mum. And
mm,
don't no disrespect to my dad who might watch this. He's
mm,
still around. My mum's not around anymore. But
mm,
my dad was busy working and wasn't
mm,
completely aware of everything that was going on. And so yeah, I think for me and my brother, we were very much alone with that.
mm. And so you have that kind of, like you say, happening on the one hand, and you are expected to kind of get on with it and still go to school and still sit your exams. Um, the component of work experience is so valuable and like missing nowadays,
Yeah.
in my experience, or it's far less provision. Um, how did that happen? Did the school make that happen, or did you go out and knock on doors, find people that would take take you on for work experience?
I think because of my interest in music already, I was aware of some places that I knew I wanted to do work experience.
Mm,
I think certainly the hire company that hired all the DJ equipment, and
mm.
I was aware of them,
Okay.
and so I would have written a letter to them and got the school to ask for that.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was definitely something I definitely didn't just pick from the list the school gave me, which I can't even remember what would have been on that, but I was quite specific.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you said so there was a course that you took that would have been GCSE, GCSE equivalent. Um, was that what you left school with? Did you leave school with a specific qualification or qualifications?
I left school with an amazing C in drama. That basically is the only GCSE I have. It's the only qualification I have to my name now.
Yeah.
So yeah, I tell this story in the podcast. I remember
Mm.
walking. I don't even know why I went actually to collect them. It's like I was living in some sort of dream that maybe I had passed some exams, but I actually went to the school,
Yeah.
and it was like deserted. It must have been summertime, or it must have been, the school wasn't full of kids. And I remember sort of
Mm.
walking down the corridor with the year head, and him sort of saying to me, it's Mr. Lockwood,
Mm.
and he was our year head, and him saying to me, "I knew you'd never amount to nothing, Mr. James," before he'd even given me the
Wow.
envelopes. And that was sort of not my last experience in that school. Actually, I had another positive experience in that school a
Mm.
few years later, which we can come to in a bit if you like. But
Yeah.
that was age 16, me sort of going, right, okay, school's over then.
Yeah. And what was your sense then? So you've got some qualifications. Mr. Lockwood's been less than complimentary. What was your plan from there? What did you decide to do next?
I had no idea really. There was some of my friends were talking about doing retakes of their GCSEs, so that
Mm,
was something that I signed up for because I thought, well, maybe I should do that.
yeah,
I already had a job, so as far as my parents were concerned, it was about going out and going to work,
yeah.
and earning some money and paying towards the rent and sort of stuff at home.
Mm,
So I remember that summer having a mix of horrible. I had a job in in a hospital laundry. I mean, it's one of the horriblest
Wow.
jobs I've ever had. Like,
Yeah.
just the smell, everything. It was just horrible in the middle of
Yeah.
summer. And yeah, it was just a mixture of lots of jobs that I just wasn't in for very long,
Mm,
trying to work out what I was going to do. But
mm,
I didn't last very long when I was trying to do my retakes for my GCSEs.
mm,
I went to a college called Basvic, which is in the centre of Brighton. And again, it
mhm.
was a place I just didn't fit in. I didn't feel comfortable there. And as well as doing my retakes for GCSEs, for maths and English, I think it was just like the basic ones, I
Mm.
was also doing photography. And there was an incident that happened. Basically, one lunchtime, someone got hold of my camera, took some photos of things they shouldn't have taken photos of. They weren't that bad. It was like basically
Right.
someone's bottom, right? It was like
Yeah.
teenage prank stuff, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I got thrown out for that. I got kicked
Right.
out of out of the college, and I got a job at McDonald's.
Right. Okay. And so what what was your kind of first step towards where you are today? So you've kind of taken on those jobs, and there is that element of, working class families where it is where you expected to graft, contribute to the household budget. If you're not at school, then you need to be earning money.
Yeah.
Um, how did you take those first steps to something that would
So
become?
I can't remember the exact timing, but a few things happened sort of in the years just after school. So one was that a music teacher who I didn't take music at school, but I spent a lot of lunchtimes in the music room
Hmm.
because I was obsessed with music, obsessed with music technology, and
Yeah.
I stayed in touch with this music teacher, and he lent me some of his personal equipment,
Mm.
so a sampler, some other stuff, which enabled me and my brother to start tinkering with making music, which we were really interested in. That same
Yeah.
teacher had also organised a sort of special day at school a couple of years before where he brought in DJs and musicians from London, and they
Mm.
had all this equipment that me and my brother had only seen on Top of the Pops, and
Yeah.
that lit a fire for me and my brother, and that's a bit of the story from school that I sort of missed, which is a sort of turning point when we were about 14 or 15, where that day happened, where we got to play on synthesizers and samplers,
Yeah.
and I think both me and my twin brother thought, this is what we want to do. How are we going to make this happen? And so
Yeah.
that was always there in the background. And that staying in touch with that music teacher was super important because one day he must have like been dropping off a piece of equipment to our house or our flat, and he mentioned this thing called the Prince's Trust.
Yeah.
And it was new then. It was probably it only just launched. It was a very new thing.
Yeah.
And he's like, "Oh, have you heard of this thing?" We were like, "No, of course not." He's like, "Do you
Yeah.
want me to help you apply for a grant?"
Yeah.
And he did. And you know, we just thought we're never going to get this. We were applying for £1,600, which is a lot of
Mm.
money to us, and it was
Yeah.
1990. It was a lot of money then, and
Yeah.
certainly to us.
Mm.
And we had to wait 12 weeks to find out. And I remember we called the office, I think,
Yeah.
every day on the last few weeks because we were so excited or nervous, or
Yeah.
basically like, have you made your decision? Have you made your decision? And I remember the day they called us into the office to tell us whether or not we'd got it.
Mm.
And they said, we basically have partly given this to you because you won't leave us alone, because you've pestered us so much.
Yeah.
And they gave us this check for £1,600.
Wow.
And being 17, maybe we were 18 by then, I can't remember.
Yeah.
But that was another huge turning point because we were able to buy some equipment
Yeah.
and start seriously thinking about making music.
Yeah.
And so that was one thing that happened. Also, around that time, we'd met some people that were quite influential to me and my brother. So there's a DJ called Dave Clarke, who was a sort
Yes.
of techno DJ. Um, so so
Wow.
I made friends with his girlfriend first. I just bumped into
Yeah.
her in a shop, and she was putting on a club night in Brighton.
Yeah.
And she's like, "You've got to come." Oh, my boyfriend's the support DJ.
Wow.
And her boyfriend was Dave Clarke.
Wow.
So I became friends with Dave and Laura when I was about 17, and I also became the dog sitter, which was, which
Yeah.
was good because I was earning some money doing that stuff as Dave was
Yeah.
DJing around the world and doing all sorts of stuff like that. And they
Amazing.
set up a record label, and they ended up putting out our first record.
Ah,
So that's a good example, I think, of like basically a theme around lowering the
yeah.
ladder, and I talk about this in the podcast.
Yeah.
Kevin Hayter, my music teacher, did that. He lent us equipment, helped us apply for that grant. Dave and
Yeah.
Laura were sort of like mentors and supporters
Yeah.
of me and my brother in making music. And then
Yeah.
another character turned up who I met through Dave and Laura, who was setting up a temporary radio station in Brighton called Festival Radio,
Mm.
which started, I think, in '89, so I wouldn't have done it the first year. But I got introduced to this guy, Daniel Nathan, who was
Mm.
setting up this temporary radio station. It's the first time the government were allowing these temporary radio stations to happen.
Mm.
And I just became a volunteer on that.
Mhm.
So I was learning how to make music, and that was my first sort of experience of radio and
Mm.
producing radio. And I pretty much lived at the studio. I always look back on that moment as almost like my unofficial degree. Um,
Yeah.
it feels to me like I was just hoovering up skills and knowledge and learning about how to how to run a radio station, how to build a radio station.
Mm.
Standing in, there was a night where I think one of the Kiss FM DJs from London was coming down and he was late, and I stood in for him for the first hour. It was like Colin
Yeah.
Dale or something like a big
Yeah.
name DJ to me, and there I was doing the first hour of his radio show.
Yeah.
So those experiences, they all came together really, and they were super important experiences for me in my sort of
Mm.
late teens.
And what do you think made it possible for you to kind of I've made some notes here about you've kind of got that passion for something you deeply care about and are interested in. There's tenacity to keep asking, can you help me? Can you help me? Then there's that thing of having a network, and it's not like you intentionally said, I'm going to befriend a DJ, but you've happened across Dave Clarke and formed a relationship without going, I would have just gone, oh wow, I can't possibly, we get starstruck. How did you at that age manage to sort of navigate that, being
I
in the
don't think
presence of someone?
I don't think I did navigate it that well, to be honest.
Okay.
I think I was definitely, I would have been in awe of Dave,
Yeah,
and those relationships are quite complex. When you're
yeah.
sort of this kid who doesn't really know what he's doing, and
Mm,
when I look back, they it was complicated. It definitely wasn't sort of all plain sailing,
yeah.
but I I don't know. There's something about like putting myself in lots of situations where I don't know how I do it, because so many of them scare me to death,
Yeah.
and yet I say yes to all these things. Even doing an interview like this, it's not natural for me to be doing this sort of thing, and
Mm,
yet I'll do it. And I
yeah.
think I don't quite know where that comes from. I don't know, how I've ended up being that sort of person that starts things or gets involved in things that, on paper, I have no
Mm,
qualifications for. In a way, I have no reason to be even doing that stuff, and yet I'll just get on and do it.
mm. It's awesome. So where does that take you then? You've filled in for possibly Colin Dale. You're learning your craft. When, where does this take you next?
So, the music stuff continues, and I guess this is the interesting thing. Right? This is quite a leap to what I'm doing now, or in some ways there is, and there's lots of bits in
Yeah.
between. I mean, one important factor that we haven't talked about that enabled all that stuff to happen, which is really important and is different now, is that the social security system was
Mm,
very different back then. In
yeah.
fact, I'm no fan of Thatcher, but her enterprise allowance scheme, the way the
Yeah.
job centre supported young people in
Yeah.
doing the kind of stuff I did back then, is very different to now.
Yeah.
And also Brighton, which is where I was at the time and where I grew up. Rent was cheap, housing
Yeah.
benefit covered your rent. You could live in the centre of Brighton, be involved in all that cultural and creative stuff,
Yeah.
and sign on, and the job centre be okay with it because you were sort of developing skills, and that might turn into work for you.
Mm.
That stuff just doesn't exist now, and maybe that's
Mm.
a bit for us to chat about a bit later on when we talk about the now. But it's important
Mm.
to say, I didn't have parents that could support me. I didn't have anyone that would back me financially. I was living on beans on toast most of the time, and
Mm.
often selling records that I bought years before just to sort of buy
Mm.
food that week.
Mm.
So that stuff was tricky.
Yeah, it is, and it does. It strikes a chord with a previous guest who worked in the arts and was involved in Newcastle area, and the enterprise allowance scheme was a game changer. It was a game
Yeah,
changer for him. So because I know obviously Prince's Trust still exists today,
yeah,
but I guess like you say, the social security system is well, it's a completely different world, isn't it?
yeah, yeah, definitely,
Um,
definitely. And I don't think I could have done all of that volunteering without it. I know I couldn't have done,
mm,
and I feel so lucky that I was able to do that because back to your last question, what happens next and where does that
mm,
lead into? I ended up signing to a major record label and with my brother, and that was quite
yeah.
messy because again, we I know everyone talks about imposter syndrome, but I just remember that time being so difficult. We were signed to BMG, or a label called
Right.
Deconstruct, and
Yeah.
or Deconstruction, sorry. Um, Kylie was on the label, M People were on that label.
Yeah.
Robert Miles' big record came out. We were on this
Yeah.
label where, it was just. I remember going to meetings in London and just feeling so out of place and so sort
Yeah.
of. So yeah, that I mean, the good thing is that they gave us a bunch of money that we spent on music equipment, so we set
Mm.
ourselves up to be able to produce. But the record we made for them never came out, so that was sort of quite upsetting. That was definitely a sort of one of
Oh,
those moments where we're like, is this the thing I want to be doing? It was
yeah.
quite painful time.
Mm.
Um, Luckily though, I'd continued with radio, and radio had become, I guess, the thing I was doing for a job. And that
Mm.
guy Daniel Nathan, who I was introduced to by Dave Clarke, who was running those temporary radio stations, employed me as a full-time radio producer. And
Right.
I was working on syndicated music shows for the Galaxy Network across the country.
Hmm.
So a dance chart show. I produced a show called Bang On, which was all about big beat music when Skint was big, and
Yeah.
that period we spent a year producing a weekly show, and then that turned into another show for the Galaxy Network. So I was producing commercial music radio basically, and
Yeah.
that was my job for a good few years, and then that turned into probably one of the luckiest breaks I've ever had.
Mm.
I ended up becoming a producer for Heineken,
Yeah.
and they basically wanted to create radio content, radio
Hmm.
programming across the Caribbean alongside a sort of music DJ competition thing, and I
Right.
became basically the producer of all of that.
Wow.
And it was just the best job I've ever had. I think one of the best jobs. I went to the Caribbean regularly. I
Mm.
went to all sorts of places around the world,
Yeah.
producing music radio and interviewing all sorts of people and working with people like Paul Oakenfold, and
Wow.
and yeah, it was crazy, really.
How did that come across your door?
Um, uh, I just ended up, when you're in that world, you just meet different people, right, that are
Yeah.
looking for people to do that stuff. And
Yeah.
because I've been producing that syndicated radio, in the UK, I just, these people just got in touch with me,
Yeah.
and I guess they liked me.
Mm.
There might have been a little bit also about my background, although that's never really been discussed. But I think there was something about us connecting,
Mm.
on that level, and yeah, I think they just liked the way that I worked.
And do you think? Because my perception is, and I'm interested to know if this is real, is is that the background might have changed. So I grew up believing that you could have a career in music if you're working class. I don't think it's the case nowadays, or I think it's harder. Is it changed?
I think it's definitely changed. I think, yeah, I mean, it's the same with the acting world and all those sort of creative industries where if you look at the data, the numbers of people from our kinds of backgrounds have gone
Mm,
down over the last 10, 20 years.
mm,
And again, I think that is partly to do with the social security system and the ability for people from our backgrounds to even get a foot in the door and do that
mm,
stuff. And I think when you look at the way a lot of industries work,
mm,
they're not always aware of what the needs are of people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds,
mm.
what the barriers might be. And I don't think there's a malicious intent to block people from our sort of backgrounds out from doing that work. I just think it's a sort of blind spot for a lot of people.
Yeah. I did read, I guess it's kind of top today. I read about what's happening in Birmingham City Council, and there was a council meeting, and one of the council was crying because of cuts to arts funding, just saying
Mm.
art is not a luxury. It's
Yeah,
a lifeline for many people.
it's been driven out of schools. It's
Mm,
it's now the reserve of the kids that are probably going to grammar schools or private schools, and then if you end up going to university and you're lucky enough to be able to do that, and you
yeah,
can afford to do a creative degree,
yeah,
that's your chance of being involved in that world. And I think for people that want to forge their own path, find their own way of doing it, who can't afford to do those things, or don't
mm,
end up in a school that still offers those kinds of lessons, your life might be void of that kind of creativity.
yeah. And how how did the contract with Heineken kind of wrap up? Was it a moment in time, a fixed gig? You got your
Yeah, it
fill
went
of
on.
spending time in the
It went on
Caribbean?
for it went on for about 6 years,
Oh,
and
wow.
so it was a nice sort of chunk of time. But
Yeah.
those things just, that like those things are normally devised by an ad agency
Mm,
who has an idea, and there's always going to be new ideas that come along. And
yeah.
I think I was just very lucky to do that for 6 years because, one of my favourite bits about it was that in amongst the radio and doing that stuff, I managed to get them to spend money on doing something that my old music teacher had done,
Mm,
and that meant that I went with a bunch of musicians from the UK, and we went to the Caribbean. We did it for 3 years, and we took a mobile recording studio there, and with all the young DJs from all sorts of different Caribbean islands who were
mm,
coming from all sorts of different backgrounds, we spent 3 days making music or helping them make music.
yeah.
And that to me felt like the highlight of that project because it's basically what inspired me, and to be able to enable a bunch of other young kids in the Caribbean, not all coming from difficult backgrounds, but certainly some of
Mm.
them would have been. um, it was brilliant.
And do you know if any, like, does any of that music still exist today, or did any of your those people go on
I
to continue their careers? Do you know?
I know that because for each year there was like a DJ competition, right?
Yeah.
So one of them would win that, and then they'd go on tour and they'd be funded to go on tour. I
Mm,
certainly know a few of them ended up becoming quite big DJs in the Caribbean
yeah.
and were doing quite a lot of work. I mean, that was back in. I started that work in 2002, so it was a few
Mm,
years ago now. So I
mm.
haven't stayed in touch with any of those people. So yeah, I hope so though.
Yeah. And what did that experience kind of give you, leave you with? You obviously didn't decide to go and work for a big corporate. What did
So this is where the
it?
next weird moment in my career sort of happened. So whilst I was doing that,
Mm,
I was so busy. I read this book called Getting Things Done, and it's like this productivity book
yeah.
that was doing the rounds back in the sort of 2000s by this guy called David Allen, American guy,
Ah,
and it
yeah.
was all about getting organised, right? And
Yeah.
I ended up getting so into it for myself that
Yeah.
friends and colleagues started asking me if I could help them, if I could coach them in
Oh,
sorting
wow.
their work lives out.
Yeah.
So towards the end of the Heineken stuff, I was also doing coaching for people, which I'd
Wow.
never ever thought I would do. And
Yeah.
then I ended up getting together with someone that I'd worked with in radio years before, and we set up a company. And that
Right.
was the next 6 years of my life, running a company, coaching all sorts of people in places like Channel 4, the post office,
Yeah.
um, the Royal Met, all sorts of organisations, coaching them how to be organised and manage their time. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I ended up doing that for 6 years while still doing some creative stuff. That stuff. I set up a podcasting company around that time as well in 2008,
Ah.
or
Yeah.
before that actually 2006, and we did a series for the Discovery Channel around pregnancy, which is weird.
Mm.
Three blokes working on a podcast series about pregnancy. I mean, I can't believe it. Really, I can't believe we did that. I feel
Um,
weird about that.
yeah.
I can laugh
Yeah.
about it now, but
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so that feels to me like pre. Do you feel like it was too early in a way?
it
Like
was. The company
podcasting's gone.
failed. Yeah,
Yeah.
the company, we shut the company down because
Yeah.
we Apple Podcast didn't exist.
Mm,
All that technology now that makes it really easy to access, like
yeah.
Spotify, none of that stuff existed. And
Yeah.
there were a few podcasts about, but it was very new technology, and there were a few
Yeah.
companies that would become interested in it, and they were mainly TV companies.
Yeah.
So Lost TV, that TV show, they had a podcast,
Oh.
and all sorts of
Oh.
other TV programs did have podcasts around that time. But it
Yeah.
was too early. It was definitely too early, and
Mm,
frustratingly, we didn't keep it going for long enough to then ride the wave that came a few years later.
mm. Um, at any point, something that strikes me, because you do coaching company, podcasting company, work for one of the world's largest beverage brands. At any point, have people said to you, well, where did you go to uni? What's your degree in?
No one's ever asked me that when I'm pitching for work, or
Okay.
when when I'm talking. That never comes up. But every
Mm,
now and then in discussions with people, like someone will
yeah.
say, "Oh, so where did you study?"
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm pretty open about the fact that I didn't.
Yeah. Do you think, given the work that you do, that the portfolio is more important than the qualifications?
Definitely, I think so. I think so. I mean, there's probably an age thing as well. Like now,
Mm,
I'm sort of I'm 50 now, so I don't
mm,
like having when someone asks for a CV. It's like,
yeah.
I can't remember the last time I did a CV. I've never had a
Yeah.
CV.
Yeah.
So I think that's the thing as well. But certainly, if I feel like if you do good work and you try to sort of, and you do that in a good way, and you're ethical, and you're a nice
Mm,
person, and you try to work in a good way, then people will
yeah.
want to work with you.
Yeah. And how did you learn how to run a business? Where?
I just made it up as I went along. I've
Yeah.
never really, no, I'm not even sure if I do it right now. I just
Yeah.
I had a friend who was also an accountant, and
Mm,
when I set up my first limited company, he was really helpful and helped me
yeah.
do all the stuff around that. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think the company I set up, the productivity company, the
Mm,
person that I set it up with, he's called Steve Stark,
mm,
and we were sort of in a way quite a good team because he was really good at the business stuff. He
mm,
studied at Oxford.
mm,
He was like almost the opposite to me,
yeah.
and he was a really good salesperson.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying he wasn't involved in all the creative stuff as well. Of course he was, but I
Mm,
guess he really backed up the ideas that I was having, and was able
yeah.
to turn that into a thing that was a business, and we were able to sell in a way that I hate that side of work. It's just not what interests me,
Mm,
and I just don't enjoy it. So I almost needed to have someone like that in that business,
mm,
to help push that stuff. So yeah, I would have learned an awful lot over that period.
mm. And you coaching, podcasting, pregnancy podcast. Um, what happened after that?
Um, I think that productivity work came to its natural end, and I mentioned right at the start the ethnography stuff. It was the end
Yes.
of that work where the ethnography stuff became an interest to me, and I
Hmm.
really wanted in the company with Steve to have a sort of research part of it.
Yeah.
And there was an amicable split between the two of us, but he didn't really want to do that, and so I just went off
Yeah.
and set up a new company.
Yeah.
And that's where the company that I run now came from, called Fieldwork.
Yeah.
And I spent, actually, there was a year in between where I was trying to work out what I was going to be doing, and
Mm.
knowing that that's what I kind of wanted to do. And yeah, I just developed this toolkit. I basically created what I think I called then a DIY ethnography kit, which was like this
Yeah.
sort of disposable camera
Yeah.
that with an instruction book and a notebook and it was everything you needed to basically do your own ethnography. And
Yeah.
I managed to sell that to companies like Capital One, the credit card company,
Yeah.
and I did another project with Abel and Cole, the food company, where
Yeah.
we used a mixture of those kits, but also I brought ethnographers and anthropologists in, and we did a thing where we documented the journey a potato takes
Yeah.
from the point it hits the Abel and Cole warehouse to the
Yeah.
point it hits someone's doorstep, and we
Yeah.
spent time with everyone in that journey, photographed
Yeah.
it, filmed it, turned it into a report. And so basically I developed this company that did all sorts of stuff like that, and that's still a part of my life.
Yeah.
And that's where the recent Kings work, I guess, fits in.
And what do you think allows you to, what helps you to operate in all these different environments and with people from all sorts of different backgrounds? What is it about you that makes that sounds straightforward for you, but I
Hmm.
don't know if it is.
Maybe it's that C in drama that I got. Maybe that's the sort of one GCSE I've got
Yeah.
in drama has actually helped me. I don't know. I think I really don't know. I have no idea. I wish I could answer that because I'd sort of want to develop it more, but it's just I guess in a way I feel like I have no other option.
Mm,
Like this is how I've worked for years, and
mm,
I I just have to get on and do stuff, and maybe some of that comes from the fact that I became very self-sufficient as a teenager, looking after
yeah.
my mum. I think also, mixing. I grew up on a council estate in Brighton, and this isn't a woe is me story. I loved
Mm,
the estate that I grew up on, and it was a beautiful place, and still is.
mm,
Um, but I grew up in that environment, right, with mainly working class people from lower
mm,
socioeconomic backgrounds. And actually, those people that I started hanging out with, so Dave and Laura,
mm,
um, Kevin Hayter, the music teacher to a certain extent,
mm,
and other people like Daniel Nathan came from
mm,
quite different backgrounds. And
mm,
somehow I found a way to be able to be around those people and
mm.
not be completely fraught with all of the sort of pressure of going, well, I'm not like them, they're not like me. Somehow I just
Yeah.
managed to navigate that. And again, I don't really know how, but it just seemed to happen.
Mm. And it's something that I'm really interested in, and I think like likewise the estate that I grew up on, some of the people are so charming. Like, and they say about people could charm the birds out the trees and think, but I was speaking to someone who said, "Oh, do you feel like a social chameleon sometimes?"
Mm,
Because I,
mm,
you know, have operated in corporates and with people from very different backgrounds, and yeah, there is a degree of that, but it intrigues it particularly with, you say working with Capital One and actually bringing some really fresh and interesting ideas and different thinking, being able to sell that, even if you don't like to sell. Um, I mean, maybe this brings us perhaps to the class divide campaign and this return to your roots or working alongside the place where
yeah.
you grew up. How does that come into your life?
Well, whilst I've been doing the fieldwork stuff, I've ended up working on a few different projects that were around sort of social justice issues.
Mm,
And around that time, my nan still lived on the estate, and I would go there, and so it's not like I was disconnected. I wasn't living there anymore, but I certainly wasn't completely disconnected from the area that I grew up in.
mm,
And I think I just became interested in you know, the community that I grew up in, and
mm,
why the place was so stigmatized and why nothing had changed there,
mm,
or it felt like nothing had changed, or in many ways things had got worse.
mm,
Um, And I ended up doing a project which was funded by the Arts Council, and which basically was training up some people in Whitehawk to document their lives,
Hmm.
and then for us to host an exhibition together of their work. And I guess that was one of the starting points really for, I guess, my involvement in Class Divide, because at that time I met Carly Goldsmith, who
Hmm.
I run Class Divide with. Um, I was doing it sort of. The exhibition happened in a venue called the Crew Club, which is on the
Yeah.
estate in Whitehawk, in East Brighton. And she was working there, and at that time, Class Divide didn't exist, but they were working on a whole load of stuff around education.
Yeah.
Um, and there was probably a year or two before we called it Class Divide, where I was going to meetings, and we were discussing what can we do about this awful situation,
Hmm.
and eventually it became the campaign Class Divide. And I guess in a way I'm really lucky that I've ended up doing all the stuff I've done across my life, because a lot of it is now really useful in a
Yeah.
campaign. Being able to make a podcast, being able to go to meetings and hold my
Mm.
own in those meetings, being able to
Mm.
hold people to account and speak up, and they're all things that you know they're essential really for campaigning. And
Mm.
listening, which is another bit of my life. I was a Samaritan for 6 years, so I learnt a lot about
Right. Wow.
listening and
Yeah.
empathy, and um, not always coming up with solutions and
Yeah.
telling people what to do. All of that stuff
Yeah.
that are sort of really important when you're a Samaritan or a listener of the Samaritans.
Mm.
So all those things have come together really, and have sort of, I hope, added to what we're doing at Class Divide.
And you've had some results, so it'd be great to hear that because you don't often get to hear this. There are lots of, there's, campaigns that I follow and things that I care deeply about. But when I was looking at the work that you're doing, I'd love for you to share some of that because it really has given me the heart and optimism that change can happen.
Yeah, so at the start of the year, the council in Brighton Hove, they voted through a policy change, which will mean that children on free school meals in the city will be on the priority list when it comes to school admissions,
Hmm.
for secondary schools in community schools in Brighton and Hove. So when I say community schools, I mean those that aren't don't have their own admissions process. So there'll be
Right.
schools like academies and some
Yeah.
church-based schools, faith-based schools. But luckily, Brighton Hove actually has a majority of community schools, so that's brilliant.
Right.
I mean, what this means in reality is in September, when parents who are about to send their kids to secondary school the following year, when they're applying for schools, they can actually apply for schools in different catchment areas
Mm.
across the whole of Brighton if their children are on free school meals, and actually have a
Mm.
much higher chance of getting into those different schools across the city. It's the first time it's happened in a whole city in England, so it's
Wow.
quite a big win, and it took quite a lot of work to get there. But we're
Mm.
almost like, I remember on the day when me and Carly were at the council chambers when the vote happened, and we were almost sort of like gobsmacked that it had even
Yeah.
happened. It feels sort of, yeah, otherworldly, really.
And it's quite something that you can, like you say, you grew up on the estate and you had an experience of the education system, which was not ideal by the sounds of it. Um, but you saw how your community was let down, and you've actually been able to come back and create change, which is so powerful.
Yeah, and but I do feel, like, I guess part of the campaign, although it's not the sort of priority, but it's definitely part of it. It's really important for me is that I'm not the only person that's able to do this from that
Yeah.
community, because that's the thing that bugs me the most. That
Mm.
in all the systems and structures that are sort of around that are meant to make this stuff right for people in society, there aren't that many people from our kinds of backgrounds working in those worlds. And
Mm.
that for me is a longer term part of the project, which is how do we switch that around? How do we make organisations like councils and schools and all sorts of other things that govern how society works more representative?
Yeah.
And I think again it is a bit of a blind spot. There's all sorts of protection for for certain groups, which are super important.
Mm.
But class and socioeconomic background is rarely mentioned when it comes to those kind of protections in recruitment processes, which I would love to see change.
Yeah. And what do you think? So you've talked about that kind of looking for better representation as a future aspect of the campaign. What is, because I was sort of having a think back through my notes here. So you've had a record deal, you've run programs in the Caribbean to deliver radio content and develop DJs, and you've hosted radio shows, you've produced commercial radio, um, you've done ethnography in a box, um, and you're running a campaign. I mean, what's next? What's on your to-do list?
Um, the thing that's always on my to-do list is some kind of stability,
Yeah,
because you know I love what I do, but the reality is, and maybe it doesn't look like this from the outside, but I think it's good to be honest about this stuff, is that when you're doing all these things, and especially the class divide stuff,
yeah.
none of us are paid at class divide. And yet it's
Mm,
almost been like a full-time job for me and Carly. I was paid some
mm,
money to make the podcast series, so that was a slightly different thing. But when it comes to the campaigning, we're all volunteers. And I think that the thing I'm yearning for is some stability financially, because
mm,
I feel like it's this double-edged sword. It's great to be doing all this stuff,
mm.
but at the same time, I come from a background where I don't have family support. I don't have, that sort of safety net to fall back on.
Yeah.
And so my work is really precarious. My life is really precarious. And again,
Mm,
this isn't a woe is me. I've decided to sort of do what I'm doing with my work life. But I can
mm.
have really amazing years and I can have really bad years
Yeah.
financially. And, that's tricky to manage sometimes. But it's partly because I want to do work that's good for the world and ethically right. And I like to work with the right people and pay people properly. And
Yeah.
you know, and I'm not obsessed with money. So in many ways, I'm not really a traditional business person. I'm happy just to sort of make what I need to live and to be able to do the stuff I want to do.
Mm. And and there's so much in that just around why you get people from better resourced backgrounds who will say, well, I'm going to go off and be an actor because
Mm.
my dad's bought me a house. I can just live in for free.
Yeah.
Or I can, yeah, go and do PR at my mum's firm.
Mm.
Um,
I mean, my dream is, there's two things I really want to do, and I've wanted to
yeah,
do one of them for ages. I want to do a proper, not full length, but 30-minute ethnographic film about something, and I've got a bunch of ideas.
yeah,
Um, that's been my dream for ages, to be able to put the time and energy into that. The same sort of time I put into the podcast series, which was a
yeah,
lot of time to research, to do the
yeah,
work that needs to be done to tell a story in that way. So that's one, and the other is to be able to set Class Divide up as a thing that doesn't just do good in Brighton and Hove, but
mm,
we amplify that stuff we've done in Brighton and Hove, and we spread it across all sorts of different places across the country.
yeah,
And I'd like for me and Carly to be in a position where we can run that, as a proper organisation. And I guess
yeah,
that's what we're kind of working on at the moment.
yeah. And that would be awesome to see. And it's funny, kind of inspired by the work that you're doing. I've had a look back at where I grew up, and actually one of my former teachers is running a project, or leading a group of volunteers to do things like buy defibrillators and put benches in where, you know, kids have got nowhere to congregate. And
Hmm.
so there's such a need for it. What do you think kind of has held you in good stead throughout your kind of personal and career life so far?
I mentioned a bit about it before. I mean, I think it connects to. I think I'm constantly acting a sieve, like a sieve. I'm in. I can do it. I can make
Mm,
this thing happen, and
yeah.
I in a way, like sometimes I sort of look at universities and the education system,
Mm.
and sometimes it feels quite restrictive in the way that it
Mm.
sort of makes some people feel like they've got to have that bit of paper before they can do a thing.
Yeah,
There's some caveats there, right? Brain surgery, stuff
yeah,
that someone's life
yeah,
depends on it. That's not what
yeah,
I'm talking about.
yeah.
But there's a whole load of other things that aren't that critical
Mm.
that you could be involved in. You could be making something. You could make a
Yeah,
podcast. You could make a radio. You could do some ethnography.
yeah,
And I think it's that acting a sieve, but at the same time also finding other good people to collaborate with that you can learn from. And I've always done that. I think I've always, when I did that Abel and Cole work, I found an anthropologist who taught me so much, and we collaborated on that project. He came
yeah,
and worked in the company, and we did that project together. And so it's sort of learning by doing and acting a sieve and trying, wherever you can, to try and cling on to whatever confidence you've got that will enable you to do that. Yeah, I think that's the thing that's definitely, been a thread that's run throughout all of the stuff I've done. Whilst at the
brilliant.
same time paddling really fast underwater where no one can see, going, how am I going to do this? How is it going to
Yeah,
work? What's going to happen? Are people going to call me out at any moment?
yeah, yeah. It is just under the surface. So where's the best place for people to kind of get in touch with the things that you do or support you or connect with you?
Um, I mean, probably the best places are. I mean, if it's for Class Divide, we've got a website, classdivide.co.uk, and you can get in touch with me via that. There's a way to get in touch with me. I'm on Twitter and Instagram, Oswald808, on Twitter and Instagram.
Okay, you need to
Um,
explain that. Come on. I know what an
Oswald
808 is,
808,
but yeah,
808 drum machine.
yeah.
Oswald. Oh, this is just sort of a bit weird actually. Like my nan bought me when I was about 11. She bought me a book about JFK,
Oh,
and
right.
I devoured that book.
Yeah,
And so that's sort of where the nickname came from,
right.
Oswald, Lee
Yeah,
Harvey
Lee Harvey
Oswald.
Oswald. Yeah.
Yeah, so, which, I'm not sure if it's the ideal thing to have a nickname of someone that basically killed an American president. But anyway, that's where that Oswald name comes from. I don't know if I've
Right.
ever actually mentioned that before to anyone.
Oh, well, you just like killing it on the decks, aren't you? So
Yeah,
that's
maybe.
allowed.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So Oswald 808 and
And
classified.
my
Yeah,
business is wearefieldwork.com.
yeah,
So that's the sort of place where all my projects live really.
yeah.
It's sort of Class Divides on there, the stuff I do for Kings, the ethnography stuff, the filmmaking that I do, that
Great.
all lives on there. That's my main sort of work website.
Yeah, awesome. Um, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for making time to come on the podcast. And
Thank you.
yeah, I'll keep watching Classified with interest.
Good, good. One last thing. There's a
Yeah.
project that we're doing for Class Divide called Neolithic Cannibals, which is
Oh,
the
yeah,
next level. It's for Brighton Festival. It's going to be on during May, from the 4th of May.
yeah,
If you're in Brighton and Hove, definitely go and see it because it's basically a piece of sound art that's being
yeah.
created by young people in Whitehawk that's going to tell the story. It's going to tell their story of life in Whitehawk, but in connection to a Neolithic camp which is in Whitehawk. So a
Nice.
little plug there for a piece of art that young people in Whitehawk are making.
Brilliant. Okay, we'll get that put up on the pod. Lovely.
Brilliant.
Thanks, Curtis.